My name is Katherine Hancock Porter, and I'm a member of Stony Run Meeting. Right now, I am in Chestertown, Maryland, the land of the Nanticoke. At this moment, I would like to invite you to feel free to pose questions in the chat at any time during this session. It is my great honor this evening to introduce Kathryn Pettus. Kathryn is a member of the Baltimore Monthly Meeting of Friends, Stony Run. Kathryn's entire adult life has been devoted to working for education and social justice for people of color. Kathryn earned bachelor's and master's degrees from Virginia State University in Petersburg, Virginia, and holds a PhD in personality psychology from the University of Illinois. Kathryn spent more than 30 years as a faculty member and administrator at historically Black colleges and universities. Among his many distinguished positions in academia, Kathryn served as president of Cheyney University of Pennsylvania for many years. After retiring from his career in education, Kathryn served in administrative roles for the American Friends Service Committee, including Deputy General Secretary for Programs Worldwide. Kathryn always seeks ways to lead and serve in the present moment. Not only is he trained as a community mediator, Kathryn holds a certificate in COVID-19 contact tracing. He has led many sessions on how to be an anti-racist within the Baltimore Yearly Meeting. Speaking personally, when I am in Kathryn's presence, I am invariably struck by his compassion combined with an unflinching moral rigor. Please welcome Kathryn Pettus. Kathryn?
Thank you, Kathryn, for that kind introduction. And thank you, friends, for joining us for this session as we go on one Black man's journey in a world of othering. I would like to share with you a poem that I wrote for this occasion titled, Way Will Open. A version of this poem may have been written by almost anyone who has been victimized by the intersection of racism, colorism, sexism, classism, ageism, and other isms of our society. When I was a child, I went out to play. No, no, they said, you are an other, you can't play with me. When I started school, I sought a bus to ride. No, no, they said, you are an other, you can't ride or be schooled with me. When I graduated college as a commissioned officer, I contemplated whether to go to war or to flee. Yes, yes, they said, you are an other, but you can die to keep my country free. When I was offered a job, I sought equal pay and authority. No, no, they said, you are an other. You can't have equal pay with or authority over me. When I became a friend, I thought surely they will see me as just me. No, no, they said, you are an other. Your voice can't be weighty with me. When I asked where do I turn, perhaps to some who are other too. No, no, they said, you are an other, but not an other like me. Then I said to the spirit, who will be accepting of me? Do not despair, spirit whispered with glee. Way will open, you will see. One day I read an expression that said, we believe that those who are called enemies are in fact friends, separated by misunderstanding. I was intrigued by the statement and saw it as a personal challenge that called for me to re-examine the way that I viewed the world. I was mindful that some people would say that even those we call enemies serve a purpose, as they tend to hold us accountable and show us sides of ourselves that we do not always want others or ourselves to see. The statement about enemies had some intuitive appeal, yet it did not seem to have real world value, particularly when applied to racial tension in our society. How do we bring people together in equality, integrity, and friendship when there are more than 400 years of confusion, misunderstanding, and yes, othering? How do we bring humans together when some have not always seen the others as humans? Like you, I was born into and live in a world where I often find myself confronted with the intersection of racism, colorism, sexism, classism, ageism, and other isms, where all of us have assimilated in one form or another the values and practices of discrimination and oppression. Regardless of which of these isms our society places upon us, we invariably seem to be inclined to discriminate and oppress others based on one of the isms or the intersection of two or more of them. They are not as I am. They are not as good as I am. They do not deserve to be treated the way that I deserve to be treated. Within my African-American community, people with lighter skin have historically been treated better than darker skinned brothers and sisters. This phenomenon, which is known as colorism, is suggested to have been perpetrated during slavery because the lighter skinned captives were often relatives of the captors. The lighter the skin, as the situation seems to suggest, the more European blood one had, thus the more human and the better one should be treated. On the other hand, the darker the skin, the less human and the less civilized the treatment. So with that in mind, I would like to take you on a journey that involves my ancestors' journeys and my journey in a world of othering. I hope that you will find it informative. As for me, thinking about my journey, reflecting on my life with all the good and bad experiences, has affirmed my desire to look for fresh and deeper ways to live, and to always try to proceed with the thought that no matter what happens next, and even the most difficult of times, way will open. I approached the development of my presentation using the format I know as memoir writing. That is, mine is a non-fictional video account of events and memories of my life as I can recall them and as I have understood them from documents that I have researched. While I've always sought to be accurate, please know that memoirs are not bound to formal expectations around chronology or factual exactness. Over the next few minutes, I will share recollections of my journey as a man of color in a world of othering. To other is to treat a person or group as inherently different from oneself. It is a way of negating that person's humanity and seeing them as less worthy of dignity and respect. This lack of respect can be revealed in many ways, such as by ignoring or discrediting that person's contributions to a discussion or meeting, by speaking over the person, by telling the person how they should feel, and so forth. Or it may be more physical, such as doing them physical harm, or simply disregarding their pain and suffering. Often when a person of color calls out a person who is not of color for a microaggression or act of disrespect, rather than apologizing and seeking to understand the person of color's point of view, they're often dismissive or act in a way that suggests there is something inherently wrong with the person of color. Tara, our Friday evening presenter, summarized it well when they said during a TED talk show, and I quote, "When you're not viewed as real people, it is easier to run over your human rights." End of quote. Each of us has many identities that define our uniqueness in the world. These identities interact in various ways that advantage or disadvantage us as we journey through life. Some common intersecting identities are ethnicity, class, gender, sexual orientation, and religion. Let's see what happens when these intersecting identities are applied to me. I'm typically seen as a person of color, or African American, or Black, or perhaps a person of African descent. For the sake of this presentation, I will say that I'm middle class. Also, I'm a heterosexual male who is a member of the Religious Society of France. On any given day and in any setting, it is likely that two identities that you would readily attribute to me if I entered a room would be ethnicity and gender, even if I spoke no words and took no action other than walking into that room. When I enter the room, it is likely that the primary identity that I would be interested in is ethnicity. The greater the ethnic mix, the more favorable I will view the setting, and the less likely I would expect to be othered. It sometimes surprises me that all people are not sensitive to this phenomenon. There is at least one other intersection about which we should probably talk tonight. In this case, I'm referring to the intersection of two continents as manifested in my genetic material, or DNA. Based upon DNA studies, my African genetic ethnicity estimates connect me most prominently with the people of West Africa, with a greater match with people of Nigeria than any other country. Also, my genetic ethnicity estimates tend to connect me with people of the British Isles, particularly Wales and Scotland. Some of my European ancestors probably left their homelands and traveled to the Americas so that they could freely worship, have greater economic stability, and preserve their English identity. However, they may have othered my African ancestors to an extent that they thought it was all right for Africans to be taken from their homelands, treated like economic commodities, and stripped of their traditions, their religions, and their prosperity. In my view, Isabel Wilkerson, in the book Cast the Origins of Our Discontents, summarizes the effects of othering and intersectionality in our country when Wilkinson says, and I quote, "This book devotes significant attention to the poles of the American caste system, those at the top, European Americans, who have been its primary beneficiaries, and those at the bottom, African American, against whom the caste system has directed its full powers of dehumanization." End of quote. There are those who say that we carry our ancestors' journeys within us every day. So my journey in a world of othering begins with my ancestors, for I believe that many of their memories of the good, the bad, and the ugly also live in me. I've traced some of my African ancestors back 4 generations, and my European ancestors 6 generations, using various family, governmental, and church-related documents. Census records have been a key source of information about my ancestors. It must be pointed out, however, that it is easier to trace ancestors when they are listed by name rather than simply a number in a census record. This is a handwritten copy of a Schedule I inhabitants record from an August 1870 census. Prior to 1870, census records typically showed the head of the household, with everyone else being listed by the number of persons in various categories, such as color or sex. Persons held in captivity were enumerated by age and sex on a Schedule II form that contained the name of the captor, but not the name of the captives. Census records in this country have a history of reflecting racism, sexism, and colorism. For example, such records have continued to have a category called race, even though there is no scientific basis for such a category. Another example is the treatment of American indigenous peoples who were not identified in the U.S. Census enumerations between 1790 and 1840. In 1860, those living in the general population were identified in the census for the first time. And beginning with the census of 1900, they were enumerated on reservations as well as in the general population. From a close-up of a section of the previous shown 1870 census, we can see the head of the household, James, a farmer, Hannah, whose occupation is listed as keeps house, two females, Mary and Octavia, listed as at home, and two males, William, who is listed as at house, and John, who is listed as a farm hand. Under color, James is listed with a W, meaning white. Hannah with a B, meaning black. Mary, William, John, and Octavia with an M for mulatto. A mulatto is a person of mixed white and black ancestry, especially a person with one white and one black parent. At least that was the listing in the 1870s. As you may have noticed, it appears that John was listed in his household with a wife, Mary, as well as being listed in the household of James, which is an abbreviation for James Speed. Other documents indicate that John and Mary were my maternal great-grandparents, and that James and Hannah were probably my maternal great-great-grandparents. If my interpretation of various records are correct, we may be looking at othering that was manifested through the intersection of class, ethnicity, and gender. That is, one person had the resources to purchase or otherwise hold in captivity another person or human being, and figuratively, if not literally, sexually abusing that human being who was not in any position to refuse. Another example of the intersection of class and ethnicity, and perhaps gender, is when President Andrew Johnson granted amnesty to upwards of 13,500 wealthy Southern whites who sought pardons for offenses that grew out of the Civil War. James, who I think was my great-great-grandfather, was one of those people. To James' credit, according to the 75th anniversary general catalog of Oberlin College, 1833 to 1909, my great aunts, Mary, and Octavia and great uncle Rufus were able to attend Oberlin College, which is noted for being the first college or one of the first colleges to admit people of African descent. And it, of course, is the first that is known for admitting women to college in 1837. I'm sure that there were many persons categorized as colored or of African descent who should have had the opportunity to attend a college between 1833 and 1908. However, there were few colleges that accepted them. Further, there were few people of color who had the financial resources to attend college. We must not forget that Mary, Octavia, and Rufus were consistently categorized as mulatto. Hence, colorism may have been a factor in their being accepted to Oberlin. In short, in this case, classism and colorism may have worked for my great aunts and my uncle, but against the people who probably deserved as much chance to have a college education as they did. A transcribed copy of the will of James showed that he decided to make a loan of many of his assets to Hannah, a loan to Hannah upon his death, and that the land that he owned was to be managed by her sons Rufus and my great-grandfather John. Please know that Rufus was older than John and not in James' house in the 1870 census that I talked about earlier. 3 states gave married women no legal status until late in the 19th century. Virginia was one of those. Though they were not married, Hannah and James did live in Virginia, so she probably could not have directly inherited assets from James, even if she had been able to legally marry him. My great-great-grandmother Hannah seems to have been victimized in multiple ways by the interaction of sexism, racism, and probably colorism, for she was listed as a mulatto on some census records, meaning that she would have been seen as fair-skinned or light-skinned. And that's important because James may not have chosen her as the keeper of his house had she been darker in skin tone. As I alluded to earlier, there is no evidence that James' wealth was allowed to be passed on to my great-grandfather, my grandfather, or to my mother. This is a drawing of the first house in which I can remember living. It was drawn by my brother Alvin. Had my mother been able to inherit some of my great-grandfather's assets, I think she would have chosen a bigger house, one that she would have owned. Instead, my parents were sharecroppers, which meant that their cinder block house was not theirs. The house contained an eat-in kitchen, a bedroom for the girls, a bedroom for my parents, and a bedroom for my 2 brothers and me. If you're counting, that means that there were 4 rooms and 10 people living in that house. When I was in the 1st or 2nd grade, my family was kicked off the farm when the landowner discovered that my oldest brother was planning to go to college. How dare a poor family of African descent to think that it was okay for their oldest son to leave the farm and go to college. Fortunately, my parents found a bigger and better place for us to live, one that was owned by people of African descent. Over time, all 7 of my siblings and I, and many relatives and neighbors from generations thereafter, followed my oldest brother to college. This record shows that in 1870, My great aunt, Octavia, taught 40 pupils, 19 boys and 21 girls, in a building owned by her father, James, for which he received $8 per month from the Freedmen's Bureau. Her teacher monthly school report, which you're looking at, says that she taught reading, writing, and spelling, that only 3 of the children were listed as free before the Civil War, and that none of the children was classified as white. There's an oral history report stating that Octavia's father actually allowed her to teach children in his house before the building that I just mentioned was constructed. Also, census records show that all of the children that lived in the house with James and Octavia could read. So someone probably taught Octavia when she was young how to read, and of course, all of the other children in the house as well. In any case, it seems that my great aunt Octavia was able to use classism as an educated offspring of a well-to-do family, and perhaps her ethnicity and gender, to graciously serve others. This is my elementary school, Cedar Grove, drawn by my brother Alvin. The work of great aunt Octavia laid the groundwork for this school to be built. As people who were othered, all the students and teachers were people of color. Ironically, my oldest brother's first job after getting a bachelor's degree was teaching in a 2-room school similar to the one that you see here. My siblings and I walked several miles to school each day carrying a book bag and a box or a paper bag containing our lunch. After school, we walked home and often had to do farm work until dark approached, then stable and feed the mules, milk the cow, feed the chickens, slop the hogs, and feed the dogs and cats. After dinner or supper, as it was called, we got a chance to do homework or read or listen to radio. This bus in this picture was drawn by one of my daughters, Kamara. My recollection is that I was in the 5th or 6th grade before the school system provided buses for children seen as Black, whereas those categorized as white had them as far back as I can remember. Many of the same people who were for busing to maintain segregation were vehemently opposed to busing to achieve desegregation. I was bused to and graduated from a segregated high school, East End High. I attended a segregated Virginia State College, later named Virginia State University. All able-bodied young men who attended Virginia State College were required to enroll in the Reserve Officer Training Corps, or ROTC, for their first 2 years. If you met certain physical and other qualifications, you could voluntarily enroll in the advanced ROTC program, which offered certain financial incentives. My family was poor, so I chose to follow the financial incentives. During my time at Virginia State, the all-Black cast of our theater guild produced some of the classic plays, such as A Raisin in the Sun, Hamlet, Our Town, J.B., and A Man for All Seasons. At the end of my first year there, I received the Actor of the Year award. During my second year, I received an invitation to apply for participation in a summer camp for young actors. With great excitement, I went to see the director of the Theater Guild for advice. She burst my bubble by reminding me that I was Black, that a stipend from a summer camp would not equal the funds I needed to earn to return to college, and that people of color did not tend to get roles at that time that will allow them to earn much money as an actor. And instead of applying for the summer camp for young actors, I applied for and got a job as a server or waiter at a summer vacation spot in New Hampshire. Many a dream has been dashed by othering and the intersection of racism, sexism, and classism. It was in the ROT summer camp that I can recall first having to personally face overt racism. Of course, it was the first time that I really had direct contact with so many people who I'm sure saw me as an other. The overt racism did not come from my fellow trainees, but from the equivalent of a drill sergeant who managed the day-to-day activities of the platoon to which I was assigned. While my fellow trainees were not overt racist in nature, they also were not what I would call allies. September came, and I returned to Virginia State College, where all the officers and most of the non-commissioned officers were people of color, as well as most of the general faculty and student body. In the summer of 1966, I began my reserve officer military career with basic senior corps training at Fort Gordon, Georgia. As you can probably see, I was the only person of color in my class. There are some who take pride in being the only. I'm not one of them, but here I was, the lonely only. My next stop was Fort Monmouth, New Jersey, where circumstances improved 100%. Instead of being the only person of color among 27 officers, I was now one of 2 persons of color among 24. Since most of us had been together at Fort Gordon, personal relationships did begin to form, even across ethnic lines. January of 1967, I was in the Republic of South Vietnam and was given command of a group of soldiers in a place called Long Binh, some distance from my company headquarters in Saigon. Although we were in an environment where life often depended upon trusting one another, regardless of ethnicity, classism, colorism, religion, whatever, I found that there was very little social interaction across ethnic lines. I left this military in 1968. And in 1969, I married my college sweetheart with many family members and friends present. The only person not of color who attended the wedding was one of my basic officer and advanced officer classmates who drove from Fort Monmouth, New Jersey to Virginia to be present for that occasion. Looking back, he was probably the first person not of color that I saw as a friend and ally in my 25 years of existence. The first time I attended an academic institution that was not legally or fundamentally segregated was in the 1970s when I enrolled in the PhD program in psychology at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. This is a drawing by my brother Alvin of Sharon Baptist Church, which I attended as a child. It was while I was a graduate student at Illinois that I first set foot inside a house of worship that was not considered a Black church. After my first retirement in 2003, my wife and I became members of Wilmington Friends Monthly Meeting of the Philadelphia Yearly Meeting. Before becoming an attender and then a recorded member of that meeting, my wife and I had often attended worship at West Town's Friends School, where our youngest daughter was a student. Moving from Delaware to Baltimore, Maryland in 2007, we became members of the Baltimore Monthly Meeting of Friends Stoner Run, Baltimore Yearly Meeting. My first non-summer job and non-military related was as a short-term replacement teacher for fourth grade students at segregated Diane Elementary School in Chase City, Virginia, while I waited to go on active military duty. After leaving the military and getting an advanced degree, I spent 24 years at my alma mater as a full-time faculty member and later an administrator. Virginia State was and is predominantly made up of a student body and faculty of color. I left Virginia State at the end of the regular academic year in 1993 to become the chief academic officer at Cheyney University of Pennsylvania. Cheyney was originally established as the Institute for Colored Youth in 1837. It was established as a result of a bequest by a member of the Religious Society of Friends, Richard Humphreys. Cheyney is recognized today as the oldest historically Black school of higher education in this country. I've been asked on a number of occasions why I chose to work at historically and predominantly Black institutions of higher education. My answer has been a question: why not? While such institutions have had their share of problems with colorism and sexism and being underfunded, they've often developed leaders and been leaders in the fight against racism in this country. Martin Luther King, Bayard Rustin, and Stacey Abrams are among many who attended such institutions. In July of 1996, I was appointed the president of Cheyney University and remained in that position until I retired from higher education in December of 2003. While president, I helped to negotiate a settlement between the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania and the Civil Rights Division of the United States Department of Education. The negotiated settlement was in response to decades of underfunding at Cheyney relative to the other 13 institutions of higher education in the state system of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. In short, Cheyney University had been subjected to decades of othering. For about 7 years, I worked as a regional director and then Deputy General Secretary for Programs of the American Friends Service Committee. Upon retirement, or a few years after I retired, and my wife had already retired, our daughters began asking us when we were going to downsize our household. So in 2019, we downsized and moved to what is commonly called the Eastern Shore of Maryland. Historically, the Eastern Shore was the home of many Quakers who were against the idea of slavery going all the way back to the 1600s. Frederick Douglass of Talbot County and Harriet Tubman of Dorchester County, well-known figures of anti-slavery activities, were products of the Eastern Shore. We chose to downsize and move to a life plan community in Easton called Bailey Chase, an axe retirement community, after doing much research over a 6-year period of about a dozen retirement communities from Pennsylvania to Virginia. As a member of the Resident Association Board and of the Hope Group that you can see listed here for my wife and me, I have witnessed increasingly focused conversations and discussion about racism and inequality among and between residents and management at all levels in the 18 months that we have been at Bailey Chase. I look forward to seeing some of the conversations and discussions turning into real actions. In addition to activities on the campus of Bailey Chase, those which are listed here, I have participated in some of the activities of the Move the Monument Coalition, demanding that the county council remove a Talbot Boys statue honoring the Confederacy from the front lawn of the Talbot County Courthouse, which of course is supposed to be a place that represents justice and equality. My wife and I are the only people of color at Bailey Chase in what is known as independent living. All the top level managers for the Axe Corporation with which Bailey Chase is affiliated are of European descent, except one. However, the staff at the bottom of the hierarchy is quite mixed and disproportionately people of color. My wife and I find this unacceptable, and we certainly hope that we will be influential in bringing about changes that represents a greater mixture of people at all levels within the structure and within independent living at the place that we have chosen to live. As this segment of my presentation comes to a close, I want to honor my ancestors and my family, especially my parents, who tried to teach my siblings and me to rise above othering and the negative consequences of the intersecting identities that we had, especially the intersection of various identities with a thing called race. As I prepared the presentation from time to time, I remembered the tidbits of information that my mother shared with me about land that she clearly thought should have remained in our family. When my mother shared those tidbits of information, her pain was so deep that I dared not ask her to fill in the details. I deeply regret now that I did not. However, as I reflect on what happened to our family, I also am aware that land was ignobly taken from indigenous people before it was taken from my family. As you look at the chair and the blanket before you, I see my mother now rocking in this, her favorite chair in her declining years. The blanket in this picture is one that I gave her while proclaiming her Queen Mother, a leader and woman of power at the celebration of her 90th birthday. This, I believe, was somewhat in keeping with the notion of Queen Mother in some parts of the motherland, Africa. I hope that my mother is looking upon me tonight and smiling, or at least not frowning at what I've shared about our ancestors. Like families, journeys are not perfect, and like families, journeys are not always of our choosing, but we must make the best of what is. Thank you for looking and listening. In keeping with our gathering theme, Way Will Open, I would like to highlight that part of the video where the landowner told my parents that we would have to move if my oldest brother went to college. I do not know how many of you recognize the incredible faith that my parents had to believe that way would open for them, for us, as they refused to yield to the will of the landowner. When the landowner said, "You must move if your son goes to college," He was in fact saying, there is no landowner of European descent who would have us as sharecroppers. That was the power dynamic operating in that world of othering. My parents' act of courage, acting as they were led, presented the possibility that our family of 10 people would be homeless. But we did open, and they found landowners who took us in, landowners of African descent. Earlier this evening, I read an expression that said, we believe that those who are called enemies are in fact friends separated by misunderstanding. Thus far, I've made no further reference to that expression, that is, until now. This part of my presentation is designed to take you on another journey, one that has led my meeting, the Baltimore Monthly Meeting of Friends at Stony Run, to something called Trust Circles. In 2018, Baltimore Yearly Meeting of Friends invited all monthly meetings to support a vision of a beloved community by forming that which was called a change group. The purpose of the change group was to commit to helping lower barriers to the involvement of people of color in monthly meetings. Also, in August of 2019, our yearly meeting approved a documented annual session titled Declaration by Baltimore Yearly Meeting as an Anti-Racist Faith Community. In keeping with change groups and the declaration, I was invited to make presentations to 3 meetings in our yearly meeting: Alexandra Monthly Meeting, Homewood Monthly Meeting, and Baltimore Monthly Meeting, Stony Run. While the sessions with Alexandra and Homewood friends were one-time activities, Baltimore Monthly Meeting saw fit to have me lead several sessions about how to be more anti-racist. The first session was 11th month, 2022. Well, that journey continues. From these sessions, my monthly meeting articulated the idea of formulating trust circles. The purpose of trust circles was to build trusting relationships across our meeting that would make our working together as friends simpler and easier, and allow us to do more and be better than we had done or had been. Our meeting has a noticeable number of people of color, African, African American, and Asian. So ours is not just a gesture of goodwill, but an important initiative as we look to strengthening and expanding our meeting. Circles, operationally defined, refers to a group of persons sharing a common interest. The interest being here to ensure that we establish and maintain right relationships with all the members of our meeting, especially people of color. As we sought to establish the right relationships in small groups, it has been our hope that the circles would expand in ways that more and more friends will feel led to become part of the larger circle that ultimately will become the whole of Baltimore Monthly Meeting of Friends at Stony Run. Instead of seeing one another as enemies who are in fact friends separated by understanding, we are trying to look at one another as friends with a capital F, who are in fact separated by othering. The trust circles are designed to help reduce the tendency of friends to look at friends who we interpret as not looking as we do, or who do not see the world as we do, and saying they are not us, or they do not deserve to be treated with respect. In short, trust circles are bringing friends together in ways that will facilitate equality, integrity, and fellowship. At this time, I'd like to share with you a very brief video about the trust circles. We have spent several months conducting workshops to get facilitators comfortable with the role that they are expected to play. We will have 3 circle meetings at different times during the 3rd week each month, with the first session beginning this month. This is the cover of our facilitators guide. In addition to have a facilitators guide, we have a participants guide, which is much shorter, but contains some of the same information as the facilitators guide. While I have been a player in the development and evolution of trust circles, there are many members of our meeting who have contributed in various ways. The names you see on the facilitators guide are among those contributors. You will meet these friends and others in the third segment of our program tonight. There are two things we hope to achieve using trust circles. One is to go forward together, sometimes talking about, but without placing blame for things that are in the past. The other aim is to build trusting relationships that will lead us to a place of being less prone to see members of our meeting in terms of us and them. These are among the elements of trust that we have explored: trustworthiness, credibility, reliability, intimacy, and acting for the good of everyone, including the self. We do not see building trust as a passive activity, but one that requires friends to vigorously engage in certain behaviors so that they will be open to establishing and maintaining a wholesome relationship with one another. In the guide, we've tried to make clear that the idea of trust circles is borrowed from our understanding of talking circles. However, trust circles, as conceived, are also similar to and different from a number of activities in which many of us have engaged. Of course, worship sharing, spiritual formation, listening circles, circles of trust, meditation, and mediation are among them. Sometimes friends are better able to understand a concept if we talk about what it is not. For those friends, we try to explain what trust circles are not. Trust circles are a mindset. Trust circles help us to see and recognize opportunities for building relationships. They help us to overcome conditioning that causes us to look for differences rather than similarities. They are an opportunity to boldly seek an understanding how others want to be treated by us. For some of us, this is known as the platinum rule. These are common words and phrases used in discussions about racism. However, in trust circles, we see them as examples of expressions that maintain us and them relationships. Further, to some of us, these expressions, as we use them, suggest an irreversible condition that is not open to change or improvement. We've tried to sufficiently define the role of the facilitator without being so restrictive that the facilitator becomes a robot. Similarly, we have given guidance to co-facilitators who should be prepared to facilitate if the need arises. In the guides, we have sometimes given general information that we hope will be useful to the facilitators, the co-facilitators, and the participants. In this case, we talk about focusing on the present. Seek to understand, not to judge. Look for similarities, not differences. Use positive words. To know and take responsibility for their feelings so that they can manage when there are things that trigger emotions. To commit to the process, to be a good listener, be a good listener, be a good listener. We tried to ensure that facilitators realize that sometimes the unexpected will happen and that they should try to be prepared to handle such moments. Each Trust Circle session will begin with introductions, followed by reviewing the guidelines, presenting a query, giving each participant a chance to share a gift that has been gained as a result of responses to the queries, and ending with feedback from the participants about how they felt regarding their experience. Each of the 3 trust circles that we have established has the potential to combine in various ways and to grow until the 3 becomes 1, which we hope will define a more wholesome and better functioning relationship across the Baltimore monthly meeting of Friends Stony Rock. At present, we have 14 queries from which facilitators, co-facilitators, and sometimes the entire trust circle may choose 1 or more for a session. If you would like more information about our work, I invite you to contact me at sixpettus@gmail.com. Thank you for looking and listening. The final phase of our time together this evening is for you to hear from some of my friends who will respond to queries about different aspects of my presentation. First, Betty Hoover, who has been invaluable to me as a liaison for evening programs. Thank you for all that you have done, Betty. If you will ask the first question, I think Kathryn will introduce herself and take it from there.
Thanks, Clinton. It's been my joy to work with you, and I so appreciate the program that you're presenting tonight. So Kathryn Pettus, Clinton's wife, I have a query for you. Clinton started the evening with a poem of which the last few lines were, "Do not despair, way will open, you will see." But we understand that you are the resident poet in your community. What's up with this? That Clinton started the evening with a poem, and this poem, what do you have to say about that? Welcome, Kathryn. You'll have to unmute, Kathryn.
Yes.
Great.
Thank you so much. And first, let me say hello to all. And I live in Easton, Maryland, and I live on the land of the Choctaw. I am also a member of Baltimore Yearly Meeting and Monthly Meeting and Baltimore Yearly Meeting. And the question was, I surprised that Clinton would start a presentation with poetry? Yes, I was. But when I think about it, the fact that he wrote a narrative poem about his experiences in Vietnam for Veterans Day, then I recall that, yes, poetry does have a place in the way he thinks and processes. The thing that poetry invites us to be precise in the way we think about things. It also invites us to respond with emotion, whether it is with something that's the tenderest side of us, whether it's the sensitive side, or whether it's the painful side. And through working through line after line, unit after unit, we somehow come to a way of understanding where we've been in this moment, or where we've traveled across moments of a lifetime. And of course, I'm a poet, and so, or I consider myself to be a poet, but certainly this is important to me. And it was such a pleasure to see Clinton use poetry to develop a framework for his presentation tonight. A lot of times when I think about poetry, I think of it as if we're weaving a garment. And if you can start with that string in the beginning and pull it throughout the entire garment, you'll be surprised at what you find at the end. just an amazing and pleasant awakening. Now, I would like for you to hear more about Clinton's friends, and they too are part of this particular section of this presentation, and they too will be responding to queries. First, I'm going to share the query and then give the friend a chance to introduce themselves. And then I'll read the query again, just so that the audience and the responder can be sure of what it is. The first friend is Chris, and the query is, have you had an experience where you think you grew as a person because of listening more deeply and openly to what a person of color was saying? If so, would you tell us about it? Now, please introduce yourself first, Chris.
Hello, my name is Chris Giannella. I attend the Stony Run meeting, and I am from the land of the Miami.
Thank you. An experience where you think you grew as a person because of listening more deeply and openly to what a person of color was saying.
Okay, yes, I do have such an experience, and it's not one that I particularly enjoy describing for reasons that I think will become clear as I go on. The incident in question happened about 4 years ago when I was attending a retreat. This was a weekend retreat for the meeting that I attend, which took place over a weekend. And I brought my son with me, who is at the time was 11 years old, and he brought along one of his friends, and both of them are white like me. And while we were at this retreat, there was another boy who was considerably younger than they were, who at the time was about 7. And he is Black. And they were spending a lot of time interacting together during the weekend. And I didn't think much of it until the final day, when we were packing up and getting ready to leave. And it started to become clear to me that there was a conflict brewing between my son and his friend and this younger boy. And so I asked my son to talk about what was happening. And he explained that his friend had brought along a toy with him for the weekend and couldn't find it when he was packing up, and thought that the younger boy had it, and that he'd asked him, the younger boy, if he had the toy, and they got into an argument about that, and they insisted that the younger boy had the toy, and he insisted that he did not. While all this was happening, the incident came to the attention of the guardian of the younger boy, who is also Black like the boy. And she said to me that she would talk to him, and that given some days, he would potentially be more talkative, and perhaps would after things had settled, would speak to her about what had happened, and that she would get back to me. So I thought this was fine. And we went away from the weekend. A few days later, I got an email back from the guardian, and it was not at all what I was expecting to see. In the email, she explained that she had spoken with her child, and that he had told his side of the story, that he was accused of having taken the toy by my son and his friend. And she was very upset about this. And she in particular was upset because she thought that it was a shame that a racist incident would occur like this during the retreat, but that perhaps she should not be surprised that these things would happen there, because they inevitably would happen anywhere, and she needs to explain to her child about this even there. And in the email, she included, she copied it to the coordinator of the retreat. Now, what happened next is something that I'm embarrassed to admit in that I handled the situation rather badly. And I got an email back from the coordinator of the retreat who encouraged and he included the guardian also in the email and encouraged us both to seek clearness to resolve our differences. Now, I thought this was a good idea, but I was also, I'll admit, quite angry about the email. I felt that my parental guard had come up, and I felt that my child was being attacked, and I was confused because I didn't see the racism in the incident that she did, and neither did my son when I asked him about it. So I contacted the guardian, and I asked her if we could speak on the phone and talk about the incident, and we arranged to have a phone conversation, which we did probably about a week or two after the email that I had received from her. And during that phone call, I explained to her that I was very sorry that my children had acted the way that they did, because I felt that they were inappropriate in that they were older than the younger boy, and they should have treated him better, and they should have been more mature for their age, and that all of that was wrong. But I also asked her about why she said in her email that this was an incident of racism, and that I didn't understand that. And I also mentioned to her the suggestion of clearness. And to my surprise, her response was rather short and rather blunt. And it was in essence that it was obvious why this was an incident of racism, and that she didn't really have any interest in talking about the matter any further. And with perhaps slightly more discussion, the phone conversation ended at that. At which point I became increasingly angry, I'll admit, and befuddled by the situation and not sure what to do. I spoke with my wife, I spoke with friends, I spoke with the spiritual formation group that I was in at the time about all of this, and I would say remained upset and remained angry for probably at least another month, maybe two. So getting back to the query about how I might have grown from listening more deeply. And perhaps the irony of it is that what I eventually learned to do was to listen carefully to what this woman had to say to me in so few words, and what she in essence didn't have to say to me, which was that she didn't want to speak any further about the matter. It became clear to me after I thought about it more and more that I had totally misunderstood the situation, and I totally misunderstood the salient points of the matter, which largely were that whether or not the incident was had racial overtones, was racist, as she put it, wasn't really something that was for me to decide or to discuss or to have her even explain to me. The fact of the matter was that she and her child had perceived it as such, and perhaps in rather painful ways. She didn't go into that, but I certainly could suspect that there was that present, and perhaps due to a history which I really couldn't understand. And that it really wasn't upon her to explain all of that to me, that this was something that I needed to figure out. And so the listening deeply came to me gradually coming to this realization that this was an issue that I needed to come to terms with, and that it was not going to be an easy one, or it was not going to be a quick one. And even to this day, I'll say, while I think I've certainly come to a different understanding, perhaps a better understanding, I hope so, doesn't mean that I feel any better about how I handled the incident. And while I've explained to my son my new realization of the matter, it still doesn't necessarily mean that I feel good about the way that either of us handled it. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Deepti? Clinton has referred to a book by Isabel Wilkerson titled Caste: The Origins of Our discontent. You grew up in India. Do you see any similarities in caste as you have seen it in India and Wilkerson's notion of an American caste system, where they said European Americans are at the top and African Americans are at the bottom of the caste system? Would you briefly read us and introduce yourself? And then I'll read a section again.
Yes. Hello, everybody. My name is Deepti Scharf. I live in Baltimore, Maryland, and I'm a member of Stony Run Friends Meeting. I live on the land of the Lumbees, Piscataway, and Cherokee, and I benefit from the 400-year-old civil rights struggle of African Americans, in which I played no part.
To restate part of the query, have you seen in India, as you compare India and the caste system and Wilkerson's notion of the American caste system, where European Americans are said to be at the top and African Americans at the bottom?
Yes, I want to first thank Clinton for bringing this book to my attention. I read through the book and then I reached out to Hindu academics and others. The book is correct that the word caste is not originally an Indian word, but derived from the Portuguese casta, meaning race, lineage, breed, and originally pure or unmixed breed. What I find most compelling in the book is the equivalence between the oppressed castes today, so between the Dalits or the untouchables in India and African Americans here. Also between the Adivasi, who are the tribal peoples of India, and the Native Americans here. And I see equivalence between the dominant castes in the two countries. But in brief talks with other Hindus, I discovered a more nuanced situation regarding caste. Historically, over thousands of years in India, castes have risen and fallen. Those at the bottom today have been at the top in history. The top caste today has lost its educational privilege and through that its power. Priests today are nearly irrelevant except for ritual. Then there is what the Islamic invasions and British colonialism and Christian mission did to the country's fabled wealth and educational system, and how that affected all castes. So, for example, all castes paid a tax for being Hindu to the Sultanate. And the self-awareness of all castes was shaped by shame and dehumanization under the British. For these reasons and many more reasons, the caste comparison, I think, between the two countries remains limited. My own journey led me from a privileged merchant caste in India to being among the lower castes in America. It led me from a majority religious group in India in which I had no specific faith identity to overnight needing to define myself as Hindu in America. I was not BIPOC until I came to America. I had no awareness of race until I came to America, and more specifically, until I began to worship with Quakers, which was after I had lived here many decades. Only since then, I'm coming to identify microaggressions. I'm becoming aware that economic and educational privilege has not protected me from racism. I'm becoming aware that I experienced racism before I became aware of it. These painful awarenesses changed my identification with American caste groups, from identifying with whites when I came to identifying with Blacks, and now a newly emerging sense that the only identification that will endure, the only narrative that will be my own, will be that of shared humanity.
Thank you, Deepti. Thank you. Erin? Erin, it's my understanding that being an ally is important to you as our society struggles to overcome othering based on us versus them, especially regarding racism. What does ally mean to you, and what suggestions do you have for others who may want to be an ally of people of color? Please greet us first, though.
Okay. My name is Erin, and I am, I attend the Stony Run meeting and Baltimore Yearly Meeting. And I live here on the lands of the Piscataway and the Lumbee and the Cherokee. And, okay, and you want to repeat?
Yes. What does ally mean to you? And what suggestions do you have for others who may want to be an ally to people of color?
Yes, being an ally means many things, or has been meant many things. And, but I wanted to start with this idea of the golden rule. You know, we're all taught about do unto others as you would have done unto you. It seems like a very simple thing you teach your kids. And what Clinton has taught me in some of this work we've been doing together is that you can't assume that what somebody wants done is the thing that you would want done to them. You don't know. And when you make that assumption, you're basically deciding for someone. And I'm learning when you can listen that, anyways, what I was going to say, it's more than the golden rule. It's the platinum rule. And I think Clinton was talking about that before, where you are listening to what other people want and asking. And so let me start by saying, being an ally for me has meant many things. Listening intently. So I find myself wanting to move things along and insert my own ideas and will. And working with Clinton on developing these trust circles has taught me to suspend my usual way of operating, to slow down and listen and be open to learning. Being an ally for me has meant recognizing humbly and with grace that I have lots to learn about being anti-racist, and that grace is important to lend each other and ourselves because we are going to make mistakes. Which is why I think of learning about racism is not as easy as reading a book or 2 or 3 or 4 books, but it takes practice being in relationship, hearing that something I've said has landed in a way that is hurtful or was just wrong headed, and accepting the feedback, picking myself up and staying with it. Being an ally for me has meant showing up and being consistent and not stopping when the moral outrage of the moment fades. Last summer, hundreds of anonymous Instagram posts were posted from people of color who had experienced at the Friends School racism at the Friends School where my kids attend. And many were recent and ongoing patterns of white teachers, for example, getting Black students mixed up with each other, even after years of being at the school, or being called the N-word by a fellow student only to have the discipline turn on the Black student, forcing them to apologize to the person who says they must have misunderstood, or that their parents insist that their children would never say such a thing. Black students care. Sorry?
I'm sorry, we have a 4-minute time limit.
And I've already hit my 4 minutes? Oh my goodness, I don't believe it.
I'm so sorry.
Okay, that's all right.
I did want to bring one other person on would you take 30 seconds and let us bring Katherine Hancock Porter on in just a minute.
Okay. Let me say that being an ally for me is grounded in the idea of servant leadership. It's sometimes hard to be the one behind the scenes, not so much for me as I was raised a Mennonite woman. Even so, it's good to remind ourselves as allies to not be self-congratulatory. We're late to this fight and I, as a white woman, have had it so easy and can at any time sit back and turn it all off. It's not a competition to see who is the most recognized ally. Don't look for praise or gratitude from people of color, because it's about time we step forward. And I wanted to end with prayer of St. Francis, just a bit. Grant that I may not so much seek to be consoled as to console, to be understood as to understand, and to be loved as to love.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Erin. And Katherine Hancock Porter, we have just a few minutes, but you're a very important person. And we have met you before, but reflecting on where you are in your spiritual journey, what have these experiences meant for you in terms of trust circles and working through to become an anti-racist activist?
Thank you. I'll keep my comments brief. You know, I'm finding that I'm so moved at the whole trajectory of this presentation. Just the way that it has built on itself, the way that that Clinton has designed it. And, you know, it's funny, I've been sort of sitting here rereading my query, kind of gathering my thoughts. And one thing that really struck me was the past tense there in the last word. What have these experiences meant to you? And I guess part of what I'm just very aware of is what this means to me right now, this evening. It was so powerful for me that Clinton began and ended his first video with the ancestors. I can't quite express in words how powerful and how touching that is for me. I've been thinking as I've been sitting here with what grace Clinton is mentoring me during the course of these conversations as we've created the trust circles. And again, I'm eager and humbly looking forward to that continuing. I was also really struck by the platinum rule, as Philip is my husband. Clinton is who I'm speaking of. The platinum rule, do unto others as they would have you do unto them. And that is, for me, also has such profound and far-reaching impact, particularly as a white person in America. And the last thing I'll say is there is nothing passive about this approach, about what I'm learning and gaining, just even as we're creating these trust circles. And I'm looking forward to, in terms of my spiritual journey, turning what I'm learning into practices, letting this be a human endeavor and making sure that others know that we're human together, letting myself make mistakes and ensuring that others have the space to do this too and are not othered, and be in practice to show up and contribute to the best of my ability and make certain that those around me are afforded the same. I could say so much more, but thank you very much for this opportunity to be with you all.
Thank you. Thank you, Kathryn. We will hand it back to Clinton for final words. We know that we have gone over time, but we so appreciate this time that we've spent with all of you, and we'll hand it back to Clinton.
I will try to be very brief and simply say to you on behalf of my friends, Chris, Deepti, Erin, Kathryn, and Kat, we thank you for spending time with us. And to our friends at FGC, thank you for working with us to get through this evening. Thank you very much.